Letty B. The Steam House, by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Chapter 14. 1 against 3. Some days passed away, and we had at last commenced to ascend the first slopes of those northern regions of India, which from rising ground to rising ground, from hill to hill, from mountain to mountain, at last attain to the highest altitude on the globe. Till then we had been rising, but so imperceptibly that Behemoth did not even appear to perceive it. The weather was stormy and rainy, but the temperature was supportable. The roads were not yet bad, and heavy as the train was, it passed easily over them. When too large a rut opened before us, Storr just touched the regulator, and a stronger press of the obedient fluid was enough to take us over the obstacle. The machine, as I said, had plenty of power, and a quarter of a turn given to the supply valves instantly added immensely to its strength. As yet we never had reason but to congratulate ourselves on this species of locomotion, as well as on the engine Banks had invented. Our rolling house was perfectly comfortable, and before our eyes we had always a fresh and ever-changing landscape. The vast plain which extends from the valley of the Ganges into the territories of Oudh and Rohilcund was ended. The north was framed in by the summits of the Himalayas, against which were swept the clouds driven by the southwest wind. It was impossible as yet to get a good view of the picturesque outline of this lofty chain, but on approaching the Tibetan frontier, the aspect of the country became more wild, and the jungle increased at the expense of cultivated ground. The flora, too, was no longer the same. Palms had disappeared, to give place to magnificent bananas, tufted mangoes bearing the best Indian fruit, and especially groups of bamboos, many shooting up to 100 feet in height. Here we found magnolias, scenting the air with delicious perfume from their large white blossoms, beautiful maples, various kinds of oaks, chestnuts, their fruit covered with prickles like sea urchins, India rubber trees, in which the sap flows through half-open veins, and pines with enormous leaves. Then, more modest as to size, but gayer as to color, were geraniums, rhododendrons, and laurels, thickly bordering the road. A few villages composed of straw or bamboo-built huts, 2 or 3 farms, buried among the great trees, were still to be met with, though many miles apart. As we approached higher ground, the population became less and less. At that time a gray and misty sky hung over the whole landscape, and rain frequently fell in torrents. Out of 4 days, from the 13th to the 17th of June, we had not had it fine for 6 hours. We were obliged therefore to remain in the drawing room of Steam House, and pass the long hours as we would if our dwelling had been a fixture, smoking, chatting, and playing whist. For long our guns had been idle, to Captain Hood's great dissatisfaction, but 2 slams, which he made in a single evening, brought him back to his accustomed good humor. "One can kill a tiger any day," he remarked, "but one can't always make a slam." Such a correct and clear proposition was unanswerable. On the 17th of June our camp was made near a serai, or traveller's bungalow. The weather was rather brighter, and Behemoth, who had been worked hard for the last 4 days, required, if not rest, at any rate some attention. It was therefore agreed that the rest of the day and the following night should be passed in this spot. The serai, or caravanserai, the inn to be found on all the high roads, is a quadrangle of low buildings surrounding an inner court, and usually surmounted by a tower at each corner, giving it quite an oriental appearance. The attendants in the serail consist of the bhisti, or water carrier, the cook, who does well enough for travellers who can content themselves with eggs and chickens, and the khansama, or provider of provisions, with whom you must treat, and whose prices are low enough generally. The keeper of the serail is simply an agent of the honourable company, to whom the greater number of these establishments belong, and they are inspected occasionally by the engineer-in-chief of the district. A strange but strictly kept rule is in force in these bungalows. A traveller may occupy the serail for 24 hours, unquestioned, but in the event of his wishing to stay longer, he must get a permit from the inspector. Without this authorization, the next comer, whether English or Hindu, may turn him out. It is needless to say that on our arrival at our halting place, Behemoth produced the usual sensation, that is to say, he was very much stared at, and perhaps very much coveted. I must say, though, that the actual guests in the serail looked at him with somewhat of disdain too affected to be real. These people, however, were not simple mortals, travelling on business or pleasure. It was not some English officer on his way to the cantonments on the Nepal frontier, not even a Hindu merchant leading his caravan to the steppes of Afghanistan, beyond Lahore or Peshawar. Here was nothing less than the Prince Guru Singh, in person, son of an independent Rajah of Guzerat, and a Rajah himself, travelling with great pomp in the north of the Indian peninsula. This prince not only occupied the 3 or 4 rooms in the bungalow, but also all the neighbourhood, which had been arranged so as to lodge the people of his suite. I had never before seen a travelling Rajah, so as soon as our camp had been settled at about 1/4 of a mile from the serail, in a charming spot beside a stream and under magnificent trees, I went, in company with Captain Hood and Banks, to visit the encampment of Prince Guru Singh. The son of a Rajah who wishes to travel cannot travel alone, that is evident. If there are any people in the world whom I have not the slightest inclination to envy, they are those who can't move hand or foot without putting in motion at least 100 people. Far better to be the simplest pedestrian, with knapsack on back, stick in hand, and gun on shoulder, than an Indian prince travelling with all the ceremonial which his rank requires. "You can't call it a man going from one town to another," said Banks to me. "It's a whole village altering its geographical relations." "I like Steam House far better," I answered, "and I would not change with this Rajah's son for anything." "Who knows," said Captain Hood, "whether this prince may not prefer our rolling house to all his large and cumbersome equipage?" "There will be only one answer to make to that," cried Banks, "though I shall have no objection to build him a steam palace, provided he gives us a good price. But whilst awaiting his summons, let us look round the camp. It is worth the trouble." The prince's suite consisted of not less than 500 persons. Under the great trees stood 200 chariots, symmetrically arranged like the tents of a vast camp. Some had zebras to draw them, others buffaloes, and besides these there were 3 magnificent elephants, bearing on their backs richly ornamented palanquins, and 20 camels, from the country to the west of the Indus. Nothing was wanting in the caravan, neither musicians to charm the ears of his highness, nor dancing girls to delight his eyes, nor jugglers to amuse his idle hours. 300 bearers and 200 guards completed the company, the payment of whose wages would soon have exhausted any other purse than that of an independent Indian Rajah. The musicians, who played tambourines, cymbals, and tom-toms, belonged to the school which thinks more of noise than harmony, but there were besides scrapers on guitars and four-stringed violins, though their instruments had never been in a tuner's hands. Among the jugglers were sapwalas, or serpent charmers, who by their incantations chase and catch reptiles; mutuis, very skilful in sword exercises; acrobats who dance on the slack rope with a pyramid of earthen pots on their heads and buffalo horns on their feet; and lastly, conjurers who have the power of changing old snake skins into venomous cobras, or vice versa, as the spectators wish. The dancing, or nautch girls, are usually very pretty and play the part of both singers and dancers. Very decently dressed, some in muslin embroidered with gold, others in plaited petticoats and scarfs, which they wave about as they dance, these girls are decked with rich jewels, precious bracelets on their arms, gold rings on their fingers and toes, and silver bells on their ankles. Thus arrayed they perform the celebrated egg dance with really extraordinary grace and skill, and I hope that I should have an opportunity given me to admire them, by a special invitation from the Rajah. Besides these people, there was a considerable following of men, women, and children in the caravan. The men were dressed either in a long strip of cotton called the dhoti, or in an angarkha, or shirt, and jamah, a long white dress, which altogether makes a very picturesque costume. The women wore the choli, a kind of short-sleeved jacket, and the sari, equivalent to the men's dhoti, gracefully folded about the body with the end thrown coquettishly over the head. Whilst waiting for their evening meal, the Hindus lay beneath the trees, smoking cigarettes wrapped in a green leaf, or pipes filled with gurago, a composition of tobacco, treacle, and opium. Others chewed a mixture of betel leaves, areca nuts, and extinct lime, which possesses certain digestive qualities very useful in the burning climate of India. All these people lived on good terms with each other, and only showed animation at the hour for a feast. They were like the figurantes in a theatrical procession, who fall back into complete apathy as soon as they are no longer on the scene. However, directly we appeared, the Hindus started up and salaamed to us, bending down to the earth. A number also shouted, "Sahib, Sahib," and we answered with friendly gestures. It occurred to me that perhaps Prince Guru Singh might give in our honour one of those fêtes of which Rajahs are so lavish. The wide court of the bungalow was there all ready for any ceremony of this kind, and seemed to me admirably suited for the dances of the nautch girls, the incantations of the charmers, or the tricks of the acrobats. It would have delighted me, I acknowledge, to be present at such a spectacle in the middle of a serai, beneath the shade of magnificent trees, and with the natural get-up of the attendants. It would all have been worth far more than the boards of a narrow theatre, with its scenery of painted canvas and its imitation trees. I spoke my thoughts to my companions, who, while sharing my desire, did not think it would be realized. "The Rajah of Guzerat," said Banks, "is an independent man, who was with difficulty induced to submit after the Sepoy revolt, during which his conduct was at least suspicious. He does not at all like the English, and his son is not likely to make himself agreeable." "Well, well, we can do without his nautches," responded Captain Hood, shrugging his shoulders disdainfully. Banks' idea was probably correct, for we were not even admitted to the interior of the serai. Perhaps Prince Guru Singh expected an official visit from the colonel, but as Sir Edward Munro had nothing to ask from this personage, he expected nothing, and did not trouble himself. We now all returned to our camp, where we did justice to the excellent dinner Monsieur Parizade served up. Preserved meats now formed the staple of our food. For several days the bad weather had prevented our hunting, but our cook was a clever man, and under his knowing hands preserved vegetables and meat resumed all their natural flavor and freshness. In spite of what Banks had said, a feeling of curiosity led me to wait all that evening for an invitation which never came. Captain Hood joked about my taste for ballets in the open air, and even assured me that it was no end better than the opera. But of this, unless the prince showed himself a little amiable, I should have no opportunity of judging. It was settled that our departure should take place at break of day the next morning, the 18th of June. At 5 o'clock, Caluth began to make up the fires. Our elephant, which had been detached from the rest of the train, stood about 50 paces off, and the engine driver was busy taking in water. Whilst this was going on, we strolled about beside the stream. 40 minutes later the boiler was sufficiently under pressure, and store had begun to back, when a party of Hindus approached. These were 5 or 6 richly dressed men, in white robes, silk tunics, and gold-embroidered turbans. A dozen guards armed with muskets and sabres accompanied them, one of the soldiers bearing a crown of green leaves which showed the presence of some important person. This important person was no other than Prince Guru Singh himself, a man of some 35 years, with a very haughty expression, of a type common among the Rajahs, in whose features are often found traces of the Maratha character. The prince did not deign to take notice of our presence. He walked forward a few paces and approached the gigantic elephant, which Store's hand was now causing to move. Then, after gazing at it, not without some feeling of curiosity, though, that he did not wish to betray, "Who made that machine?" he demanded of Store. The engine driver pointed to the engineer who had joined us, and was standing a short distance off. Prince Guru Singh expressed himself very easily in English, and turning towards Banks, "Did you make—" he forced himself to say. "I did," replied Banks. "Did not someone tell me that it was a fancy of the late Rajah of Bhutan?" Banks signed an affirmative. "What is the good," returned his Highness, rudely shrugging his shoulders, "what is the good of being dragged about by a machine when one has elephants of flesh and blood at one's command?" "Probably," said Banks, "because this elephant is more powerful than all those of which the late Rajah made use." "Oh," said Guru Singh contemptuously, "more powerful!" "Infinitely more so," returned Banks. "Not one of yours," put in Captain Hood, who much disliked these manners, "not one of yours would be capable of making that elephant stir an inch, if he did not wish it." "You say," said the prince. "My friend asserts," replied the engineer. "And I also asserted that this artificial animal could resist 10 pair of horses, and that your 3 elephants, harnessed together, could not make him move a foot." "I don't believe a word of it," replied the prince. "Then you are quite wrong not to believe a word of it," replied Captain Hood. "And if your Highness chooses to name a price," added Banks, "I will engage to supply you with one that will have the strength of 20 of the best elephants in your stables." "It is easy to say so," replied Guru Singh dryly. "And it is easy to do so," returned Banks. The prince began to get exasperated. It was plain to see that he could not stand contradiction. "Can the experiment be made here?" he asked, after a moment's thought. "It can," replied the engineer. "I should like," added Prince Guru Singh, "to make this experiment the subject of a considerable wager, unless you draw back at the fear of losing it, as no doubt your elephant will draw back when he has to struggle with mine." "Behemoth draw back!" exclaimed Captain Hood. "Who dares to say Behemoth will draw back?" "I do," returned Guru Singh. "And what sum will your Highness wager?" asked the engineer, folding his arms. 4,000 rupees, replied the prince, if you have got 4,000 rupees to lose. This would amount to nearly 400 pounds. The stake was considerable, and I could see that Banks, confident as he was, did not much care to risk such a sum. As for Captain Hood, he would have betted double that, if his modest pay would have allowed such a proceeding. You refuse? At last said His Highness, to whom 4,000 rupees merely represented the price of a passing fancy. You are afraid to risk it? Done! Exclaimed Colonel Munro, who had just approached, and now uttered the single word which was of much consequence to us. Will Colonel Munro wager 4,000 rupees? Inquired Prince Guru Singh. Or even 10,000, answered Sir Edward, if that would suit your Highness better. Be it so, replied Guru Singh. This was becoming interesting. The engineer grasped the colonel's hand, as if to thank him for saving him from the affront offered by the haughty Rajah, but his brows knit for a moment, and I wondered whether he might not have presumed too much on the mechanical power of his apparatus. Captain Hood had no such fears. He beamed all over, rubbed his hands, and advancing towards the elephant, "Attention, Behemoth!" he cried. "You have to work for the honor of old England, remember!" All our party stood together at the side of the road. About 100 Hindus left their own camp and ran to be present at the forthcoming trial. Banks left us and mounted into the howdah beside Store, who by means of an artificial draught was blowing up the furnaces so as to send a jet of vapor through Behemoth's trunk. Whilst this was going on, at a sign from the prince, several of his servants went to the Serai and brought back the 3 elephants, freed from all their traveling harness. They were magnificent beasts, natives of Bengal, and much taller than their brethren of southern India. The sight of these superb animals, in all their pride of strength, caused me a qualm of uneasiness. The mahouts, perched on their great necks, guided them by hand and voice. As these elephants passed before His Highness, the biggest of the 3, a regular giant, stopped, bent his knees, raised his trunk, and saluted the prince like the well-trained courtier that he was. He, with his 2 companions, then approached Behemoth, whom they apparently regarded with astonishment, mingled with some fear. Strong iron chains were fixed to the tender of our elephant. I confess my heart beat quick. Captain Hood gnawed his mustache and fidgeted about with anxiety. Colonel Munro was calm enough, far calmer indeed than Prince Guru Singh. "We are ready," said the engineer, "when your Highness pleases." "It pleases me now," returned the prince. Guru Singh made a sign. The mahouts uttered a peculiar whistle, and the 3 elephants, planting their huge feet firmly on the ground, drew all together. The machine began to move. A cry escaped me. Hood stamped. "Put on the brakes," said the engineer quietly, turning to the driver. And with a quick turn, followed by a rush of steam, the atmospheric brake was instantly brought to bear. Behemoth stopped, immovable. The mahouts excited the 3 elephants, who with straining muscles renewed their efforts. All was in vain. Our elephant appeared rooted to the ground. Prince Guru Singh bit his lip till the blood came. Captain Hood clapped his hands. "Forward!" cried Banks. "Yes, forward!" repeated the captain. "Forward!" The regulator was open wide. Great puffs of vapor issued from the trunk. The wheels turned slowly round, and the 3 elephants, notwithstanding their struggles, were drawn backwards, making deep ruts in the ground as they went. "Go ahead! Go ahead!" yelled Captain Hood. And as Behemoth still moved forward, the enormous animals fell over on their sides and were thus dragged some 20 feet, without apparently making any difference to our elephant. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" shouted the captain, who could not contain himself. They might fasten the whole Serail onto His Highness's elephants. It wouldn't weigh more than a cherry to our behemoth." Colonel Munro made a sign. Banks closed the regulator, and the machine stopped. Anything more piteous to behold than the prince's 3 elephants now could not be seen. There they lay, their trunks covered with mud, their great feet waving helplessly in the air like gigantic beetles turned on their backs. The prince, both irritated and ashamed, had by this time departed, without waiting for the end of the experiment. The 3 elephants were now unharnessed. They rose, visibly humiliated by their defeat. As they repassed Behemoth, the largest, in spite of his driver, could not help bowing his knees and saluting with his trunk, just as he had done to Prince Guru Singh. In a quarter of an hour a Hindu, the Kamdar, or secretary of His Highness, appeared in our camp, and handed to the colonel a bag containing the lost wager of 10,000 rupees. Sir Edward took the bag, but tossed it scornfully back, saying, "For the people of His Highness." Then turning on his heel, he walked quietly into Steam House. No better way could have been devised for putting down this arrogant prince who had so contemptuously provoked us. Behemoth being now in his place, Banks gave the signal, and we started off at full speed, in the midst of an enormous crowd of amazed and wondering Hindus. Shouts and cries saluted us, and soon a turn of the road hid Prince Guru Singh's camp and Serail from our sight. The next day, Steam House began to ascend an acclivity which connects the level country with the base of the Himalayan frontier. This was mere child's play to our behemoth, whose 24 horsepower had enabled him successfully to cope with Prince Guru Singh's 3 elephants. He pressed easily up the steep roads of this region without its being found necessary to increase the regular pressure of steam. It was indeed a strange sight to see our colossal animal breasting the hill, giving vent to snorts and shrieks as he dragged our train up after him. Our heavy wheels crashed and ground along, not, it must be confessed, to the improvement of the roads, in which, already softened by torrents of rain, they made deep ruts. In spite of it all, Steam House gradually rose, the panorama widened, the plain subsided, and towards the south of the horizon stretched at last further than the eye could reach. We were more sensible of the effect produced when for some hours the road lay under the trees of a thick forest. Now and then a wide glade opened before us, like an immense window on the mountain ridge, when we would stop our train for a minute or two if the landscape was misty, or for half a day if the view was clear. All 4 then, leaning out of the back veranda, would take our fill of gazing at the magnificent panorama extended before our eyes. This ascent, interrupted by more or less prolonged halts, for the view as well as for night encampments, continued for no less than 7 days, from the 19th to the 25th of June. "With a little patience," remarked Captain Hood, "our train will mount to the very highest summits of the Himalayas." "Don't be too ambitious, Captain," responded the engineer. "It could do it, Banks." "Yes, Hood, it could if the practicable road did not soon come to an end, and provided we carried fuel, for that we should no longer find amongst the glaciers, besides respirable air, which would be wanting up there. But there is no need for us to do more than just pass the habitable zone of the Himalayas. When Behemoth has attained a medium altitude, he will stop in some pleasant spot, on the border of an alpine-like forest, in delicious air refreshed by the breezes from above. Our friend Munro will have transported his Calcutta bungalow on to the mountains of Nepal. That is all, and there we can stay as long as we like." On the 25th of June we found the halting place, in which we were to camp for several months. For 48 hours the road had been becoming less and less practicable, being either half made or deeply cut up by the rain. It was a regular tug for Behemoth, but he managed it by devouring a little more fuel than usual. A few pieces of wood added to Kalu's furnace served to increase the steam pressure. For this last 48 hours our train had been traveling through an almost deserted country. Settlements or villages were no longer to be met with, only here and there a farm or isolated dwelling buried in the great pine forests with which the southern ridges bristled. 3 or 4 times a solitary mountaineer greeted us with admiring exclamations. No doubt, on seeing the marvelous apparatus ascending the mountain, they imagined that Brahma had taken it into his head to transport an entire pagoda to some inaccessible and lofty height. At last, on the 25th of June, Banks gave the word to halt, and thus ended the first part of our journey into northern India. The train came to a standstill in the middle of a wide glade, near a torrent, the limpid waters of which would supply the wants of our camp for several months. Our outlook, too, extended for 50 or 60 miles over the plain. Steam House was now 975 miles from its starting place, 6,000 feet above the level of the sea, and resting at the foot of the Dhawalagiri, whose summit rises 27,000 feet into the air. End of chapter 14.